This video will be about the in terms of review, going over those specific questions that are going to limit the types of answers that you can give by saying in terms of. So the first thing that I want to point out is that anytime on the Regents exam, if you see the words in terms of, you want to underline what comes after it, and you want to make sure that you make reference to whatever terms they give you in the question. This is a way of the Regents exam limiting the types and different amounts of answers that we can accept. So if it says in terms of electron configuration, why arsenic and antimony are chemically similar. First of all, if you do not know who arsenic and antimony are, you're going to look up on table S. You're going to look up their symbols. Arsenic happens to be AS. Antimony happens to be SB. Now, if it didn't say in terms of electron configuration, you might be inclined to say that they are chemically similar because they are in the same group. But because it says in terms of electron configuration, you must mention that they have the same numbers of valence electrons. For number 2, there's a bunch of reading here, and then it says in terms of subatomic particles, why the radius of a lithium ion is smaller than the radius of a lithium atom. Now remember, subatomic particles could be protons, neutrons, and or electrons. You may have to mention more than one of those types of particles. You may have to only mention one of those types of particles. Sorry, I'm using a different tablet than normal, and this one's a little bit more difficult to use. So in terms of subatomic particles, when we're talking about radius of an ion versus an atom, lithium is a metal. So the lithium atom loses electrons to become the lithium plus ion. The lithium atom is bigger, the lithium plus ion is smaller because the atom loses electrons to become the ion. For number 3, it says, has a whole little reading here which you can pause and read. And then it says in terms of electrons, how the salt emits colored light. So when we are talking about electrons and light, we are talking about when electrons go from excited state to the ground state. They give off energy as light. Next question, again, bright line spectrum. This time it says both electrons and energy state. So again, you're going to say when electrons go from excited state to the ground state, they give off energy as light. A lot of times these in terms of questions are repeated, which is why I like to go over these because of the fact that going over them will help you go over and get some extra points for the part 2. This question, you can pause and do the reading. It says in terms of neutrons, how tritium differs from an atom of hydrogen 1. In the reading, they tell you that tritium is hydrogen 3. Remember, they are giving you the mass number. Hydrogen-3 is hydrogen with a mass number of 3. Hydrogen-1 is hydrogen with a mass number of 1. Remember, if we do mass number minus atomic number, we get neutrons. So these differ from each other because they have different numbers of neutrons. You could say that tritium has more neutrons, and this is not what was asked, but they are isotopes extra information. They are isotopes because they have the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons. Next question has a big long reading that has nothing to do with this particular question, but here it says, in terms of polarity of sugar molecules, why sugar dissolves in water. Remember that like dissolves like, which means that polar molecules dissolve in other polar molecules. So your answer would be that sugar dissolves because it is polar like water. So the reason why in terms of polarity if something dissolves in water is because it is also polar. For this question right here, in terms of distribution of charge, why is substance 3 nonpolar? So remember we said that for molecules, symmetrical means nonpolar, asymmetrical means polar. So this is nonpolar because it has a symmetrical, sorry I can't spell, distribution of charge. For the next question in this packet, I just copied diagram 1 because of the fact that it wasn't here. We would have to go back to the page before. The chemical bonds, in terms of valence electrons, how the chemical bonds form in diagram 1. Remember, this is ionic. So in terms of valence electrons, electrons are transferred. Okay, again, this is ionic, and we said that when it's an ionic bond, the electrons are transferred. If instead they asked about a metal and a nonmetal in terms of element classification, so this one is still ionic because it's a metal and a nonmetal. In terms of element classification, it would be because a metal and a nonmetal are bonding. The next question says, in terms of electron shells, why each successive element as we go down group 14 has a larger atomic radius. And remember, as we go down a group, we increase the number of electron shells. For this question, if we want to talk about why in terms of ions there is more ability to conduct electricity in the solution in beaker 4 than the solution in beaker 1. This is a concept that has come up on a few successive Regents exams, and that would be because you can either say because there are more ions present in sample 4, or that there is a higher concentration of ions. In beaker 4. Remember, the ions are the charged particles that carry the electricity, so more charged particles means more ability to conduct electricity. Once again, you can pause and read the question and look at everything, but it says in terms of molecular polarity. If we're talking about molecular polarity, why solubility of something is better in water than something else, remember, if methanol is soluble in water, it must be polar or more polar. And then methane must be nonpolar, or you could say less polar, because remember, polar dissolves polar, like dissolves like. Something that is polar would dissolve in something else that is polar. In terms of electronegativity differences, why a bond is more polar than another bond, we say that the higher the electronegativity difference means more polar. So the C to O bond must have, I should say, the C to O bond has a higher electronegativity difference. We find those on table S and we subtract them. They literally mean difference like subtract. For 15, in terms of bonds, why energy is absorbed. When bonds are broken, energy is absorbed. Energy is released when bonds are formed. So we would say bonds are broken. In terms of ions, why 0.3 molar NH4Cl is a better conductor than 0.1. Again, higher concentration of ions means better conductor. Here's another one that says, in terms of molecular polarity, why something dissolves in water. You might notice that this has repeated a few times. In terms of molecular polarity, if something dissolves, it is because it is polar. Which is like water, which is why it would dissolve. Now, there's a whole reading here. You can pause to read the reading if you'd like for the next question. In terms of particle distribution, why something is a homogeneous mixture. Remember that homogeneous means that the particles are evenly distributed. For 19 and 20, there's that reading that you can pause to read, but it says in terms of intermolecular forces, why the boiling point of something is higher than the other. You would say then that if hydrazine's boiling point is higher, hydrazine must have stronger intermolecular forces of attraction. Some people say IMF, some people say IFA. Whichever one your teacher uses is fine. But either way, higher boiling point means stronger intermolecular forces. Oh my goodness, again, in terms of molecular polarity, why something is soluble in water must mean that it is polar like water. See some repeats here. So again, you can pause to read the reading. This one, this particular question says in terms of heat of fusion and heat of vaporization, why the heat added during interval DE is higher than BC. Remember, DE is boiling and BC is melting. And it is because the heat of vaporization is higher than the heat of fusion, because it says in terms of heat of fusion and heat of vaporization, you have to mention both. Heat of vaporization is a higher amount of heat than the heat of fusion. Next question says, in terms of collision theory, why an increase in temperature increases the rate of reaction. Remember, anytime we increase the temperature, there will be more collisions. And so that would mean that there will be more effective collisions. In terms of activation energy, why the catalyzed reaction occurs at a faster rate, because the catalyzed, catalyzed reaction has a lower activation energy. Okay, the catalyzed reaction has a lowered activation energy. In terms of atoms, why they are not isomers, isomers have to have the same molecular formula and different structural formulas. They have different numbers of atoms per formula. This is C1 to C2, H6O, C2, H5O, and so they have actually different numbers of hydrogen atoms per formula. In terms of bonding, why it is unsaturated, saturated has all single bonds. So if we are talking about unsaturated, it is not all single bonds. For this particular question, it says in terms of intermolecular forces, why it has a higher boiling point. This is the second time we've seen intermolecular forces in boiling point. And remember that higher boiling point means that it has stronger intermolecular forces, or if your teacher says IFA for intermolecular forces of attraction. For this question right here, it says, explain in terms of molecular formula and structural formula why it's an isomer of propene. That means you have to mention both. Remember that it is an isomer because isomers have the same molecular formula, but different structural formulas. Oh, gee, again, in terms of polarity, why something is soluble in water. Hopefully you remember this by now. Anything that is soluble in water is soluble because reactant 2 is polar like water. In terms of energy, why it's an electrolytic cell. Remember that since electrolytic cells are non-spontaneous, it requires an outside source of electricity. Electricity or electrical energy. Or you can even say that it takes in electrical energy, like an electrolytic cell. For this question, in terms of atoms and ions, while the electrode decreases, magnesium is my anode. And the anode here, notice it goes from Mg solid to Mg plus 2. So in this case, the Mg atoms lose electrons and become Mg plus 2 ions. That's one way to say it. Or you could say that the atoms become ions that go into solution. Remember, the atoms are part of the electrode. The ions are in the solution. In terms of energy, why this is a voltaic cell. It is a voltaic cell because electrical energy is given off. Or you could say that chemical energy is converted to electrical energy. This one is similar to another question that we just did. Anytime you are talking about an anode getting smaller, it is because the atoms, so in this case it was the Ag atoms, become Ag plus ions in solution. At the anode, the atoms become ions. If this had asked instead why the cathode gets bigger, at the cathode, ions become atoms. In terms of reaction rates, why they remain constant, here it says that it is in equilibrium. In terms of reaction rates, it would be because reaction rates are equal. Remember the definition of equilibrium: equal rates, constant concentrations. In terms of the pH scale, why it is acidic, so you have to mention the placement on the pH scale, and you would say because the pH is below 7. In terms of the pH scale, it is acidic because it is pH below 7. In terms of particles and the atoms of an element, it says all atoms of one element have the same mass. In terms of particles and the atoms of an element, statement C is false because atoms can have different numbers of neutrons. And in terms of particles, why A is no longer accepted, we know that atoms are made of smaller parts. Mainly protons, neutrons, and electrons. In terms of electron configuration, why they do not readily form compounds, they are talking about making a noble gas, and we know that noble gases have a stable valence shell, or you could say 8 valence electrons. Hopefully that was helpful. That, in terms of review, was a quick video, but hopefully by seeing the different things that get repeated over and over again, that will help you to be ready to tackle these questions on the Regents exam. Thank you. Have a good day.